Okay, so I'd like to start this evening. I'm hoping you're seeing my screen here for those who can see a screen.
Yes.
And um, following our last study last week on the antitypical time of the fifth and sixth trumpets, I wanted to do a brief update tonight on developments in the meantime, since we were looking for or I was looking for a significant developments to begin the fulfillment of the fifth trumpet in antitype on or about September 20th. And again, I have said on or about because when you're trying to calculate the time between two dates, it depends on whether you're using inclusive reckoning or not, whether you include the current day as the start date as a day or the day after the start date as day one. So I was looking really for something to be happening on September 20th or perhaps the 21st of 2024. I actually have here on the screen the timeanddate.com website where it shows the part of the way that I came to that date of September 20th, 2024, and that was by beginning at the end of the seven times or 20 days from the Pope's visit in September 2015 to the summer of 2022, specifically August 21st, 2022, taking that as the date as a antitypical 538 date from the year 538 to the start of the fifth trumpet in historical type, which was on July 27th, 1299. That would be 761 years, or according to the biblical day-year-day principle of prophetic interpretation, for us it would be 761 days. So if you add 761 days to that beginning marker point, it brings you see the result down here in the bottom left-hand corner, Friday, September 20th, 2024. If I bring up this timeline for us, um, I hope you can see that as well. Yes, Brother Chris?
You cannot see it. No, it's too small.
Well, but you can see that there's a timeline on the screen as opposed
Oh,
to,
oh yes, yes.
okay, all right. Well, in the video, if you can watch the recording later, you will be able to, I pray, see it better. And of course, I believe you're using a phone, and of course, it's much harder to see anything written on a phone screen because it's so small. And I apologize for that, but this is as big as
That's
I can
perfect.
make it.
That's
Um,
perfectly all right.
and again, connected with the uploading of that last video, I did make a way for people to download a PDF of this time chart or time charts. And in that PDF, you can zoom in and out as much as you need to be able to read it at any level of resolution, no matter what device you're using. So in our study last week, I went through the basic patterns of seven in history. We had the archetypal pattern around the cross, which was the archetypal judgment of the living, corporate close of probation pattern, as I say on this first screen. And then we also had the 7 years that preceded the destruction of Jerusalem. We have the two historical, typical seven times timelines in history, one from 723 BC in the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel to 1798, and the other one from 677 BC in the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah to Assyria. William Miller found, and that brings us to 1844. The first time period actually being found second after the one that William Miller found, and the second one was found or discovered by Hiram Edson, as we discussed. And then we were taking these patterns in history and then applying them to the end time corporate judgment of the living process. and the close of probation timeline in our day, according to, again, this biblical day, year, day principle of prophetic interpretation, of which, again, we have many studies online. And we saw that there were actually 3 overlapping patterns of 7, one connected with Christ's ministration in the most holy place and his, just going to ask people to be, okay, everybody is now muted until you actually have something to say. I welcome questions and participation, but when you're not actually participating, please try to be muted. So we have ultimately 2 patterns of 7 at the top of the screen here, connected with the first 7 years, or 20 days connected with the most holy place, and then another 7 years connected with the holy place and the outer court, but that there were actually 3 patterns we see below that follow the archetypal pattern around the cross, that each one was connected with each of the 3 compartments. We had a 7-year period from September 2015 to August 2022 that represented the final corporate judgment of the living process connected with those in a professed most holy place relationship. And in the midst of that pattern, on March 10th, 2019, that's when Christ moved from ministering before the throne as high priest in the most holy place to actually being placed back upon the throne as king in his second coronation, or we would say the Son of Man in the cloud upon the mercy seat, according to Leviticus 16:2, or Daniel 7:13 and 14, or ultimately Revelation 14:14. And or Revelation 5, really, in the Son of Man in the midst of the cloud, as a lamb as it had been slain. And it's also connected with Michael standing up in Daniel chapter 12. And all of these things happened on March 10th, 2019, and that's when the judgment of the living officially began. And that's when the antitypical seals began being broken. And Christ has 7 sprinklings of blood in the most holy place, according to the liturgy of the Day of Atonement found in Leviticus and in the book of Exodus. And we've seen that those 7 sprinklings are actually connected with an antitypical loosing of the 7 seals, because the seals are especially associated, particularly the first 4 seals, with the most holy place, as they're each introduced by one of the living creatures that surround the throne in the most holy place. But then that there was also 7 sprinklings that would happen in the holy place after the high priest was moving out of the sanctuary at the closing scenes of the Day of Atonement, and that he would move to the 4 horns of the golden altar and place the blood there. That's again kingship imagery. And then he would sprinkle the blood 7 times, and that would be connected with a antitypical loosing of the 7 trumpet, or blowing of the 7 trumpets. And then ultimately Christ will have to move to the courtyard and to the horns of the brazen altar. And again, he would place the blood on the 4 horns of the altar and sprinkle the blood 7 times. And those 7 sprinklings are actually connected with the 7 last plagues. But again, it was this second pattern in the middle here that was especially connected with the blowing of the trumpets, because it's connected with the horns of the golden altar in the holy place. And we saw that that was connected with the judgment of the living on Sunday-keeping Christians, or the Samaritans, as it were. And then it's the uttermost parts of the earth connected with the final pattern of 7. So we looked at the corporate judgment pattern for God's end-time remnant people. I'm not going to rehash that. But coming to this more blown-up view with more information on the time and what we would be expecting to be happening, or what has happened during this second pattern of 7. This is again how we're coming to seeing an antitypical fulfillment of the trumpets. Again, back in the 2 7 times timelines in history, this is when the trumpets fulfilled in historical type, again, beginning on July 27th, AD 1299, when the Mahometans tormented the Eastern Roman Empire for 5 prophetic months or 150 years, which brings us to July 27th, AD 1449, when the false Christian powers yielded to the Mahometans, or the Muslim power at that time, the Ottoman Empire. After a 4-year siege, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, fell by fire, smoke, and brimstone. And then a prophetic hour, day, month, and year later, or 391 years and 15 days, on August 11th, 1840, the Ottoman Empire's supremacy ceased when it willingly yielded to the false Christian powers in a chiastic mirror reflection, as had been prophesied or predicted by Josiah Litch according to his understanding and exposition of Revelation chapter 9. And we also saw how it brought about a wonderful impetus for the Millerite Advent movement. And how those fulfillments were not just to the literal year, but actually had a fulfillment to the literal day. And so when we transpose those dates to this antitypical period connected with the trumpets, in our day, which actually begins on March 10th, 2019, and the midpoint was August 21st, 2022, it will ultimately conclude in February 2026, but the dates that corresponded to the antitypical fulfillment of the fifth trumpet began, according to the pattern, would be September 20th, 2024. And that's why I believed that significant events would begin to happen there, and that they would last for 150 days, which will bring us to February 17th to 20th, 2025, when we would expect an antitypical fulfillment of the sixth trumpet to begin, which would last for a literal hour, day, month, and a year, or 391 days, ultimately bringing you to March 15th, 2026, which would correspond to the August 11th, 1840 date. Now, on this chart, I suggested, based on the historical typical pattern, that we might expect terrorist attacks to be attributed to radical Muslims upon the eastern seaboard of the U.S., which I see as the eastern division of the end-time Roman Empire, that shall cause spiritual confusion about the fulfillment of end-time prophecy. And so the first thing I want to address tonight is clearly that isn't what seems to have happened. And I was not directly correct about that, but I don't think I was entirely wrong either, and we'll look at why that is tonight. I do believe that because there were very significant things that actually did happen last week, beginning on September 20th and September 21st, that we're going to look at, that I believe that we can see as being in harmony with the original historical typical principles of the fulfillment of the prophecy, and so could be seen as the start of the antitypical fulfillment. And I believe there's a way that we can understand what did happen as something that will lead ultimately to the fulfillment of these attacks that began actually in the Middle East with our supposed allies there, at least as perceived by the evangelical Christians who have a strong influence on the policies of our government, and who have a dispensational view of the fulfillment of prophecy connected with Israel in the Middle East, that those things that are happening began to really be happening in the Middle East last week in a very dramatic way, will ultimately lead to consequences here in the eastern U.S. during these 150 days. So let's see if we can look at what actually happened last week, and can we have some insight to do these developments actually seem to fit the pattern, again, of a Muslim power, as it were, attacking the Western powers, which is what happened historically. So, of course, again, there can be this idea that things can have a parallel in contrast. Just like the beginning of the historical period, before we get to that, the beginning of the historical fulfillment of the trumpets, the sixth trumpet began actually with the seemingly Christian power. I call it a false Christian power because it was connected with Catholicism, yielded to the Muslim power, or as they said, the Mahometans. And then the conclusion of the period in 1840, it was the opposite. It was the Ottoman or Muslim or Mahometan power yielded back to the Christian power. And there was a chiastic mirror there in the contrast between the two, or how it was actually the opposite thing happening. So last week we talked about in our studies how there had began to be significant developments in the what was happening in the Middle East between Israel and its perceived enemies or actual enemies there in the Middle East, and how there were these very novel and dramatic cell phone or two-way radio attacks or pager and two-way radio explosions were attributed to Israel attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon. And those happened in the days leading up to, just a couple days leading up to September 20th. And then we see here in a headline from the Washington Free Beacon from September 20th, we see the date here, September 20th, 2024. And the headline says, Israeli forces kick off a, quote, new era in its fight against Hezbollah, eliminating 20 of the terror group's senior commanders. So there actually are these Muslim powers that are professed Muslim powers that have these groups that are at least attributed to be terror groups by the Western powers and by Israel that have been attacking Israel. And then Israel had this retaliation, as it were, or increase in activity, military activity, to try to deal with their perceived enemies. And it kicked off a, quote, new era. I think that's very interesting that on the very day that we were expecting a significant development in a clash of civilizations, as it were, between Western powers or perceived Western powers and perceived Muslim or Mahometan powers, that a new era of that conflict began on that very day, according to just ordinary headlines in the news. Now, we won't get into the details of exactly what happened there, but it's interesting that that is how it was perceived and how it's being presented to the people in the news. We also see that here in the article, it talks about how these developments are also being very closely watched and coordinated together with the White House here in America, in the East Coast of the United States, in the capital political center of power here on the East Coast of the United States. So to say that this has nothing to do with the United States, I don't think is actually accurate. Clearly, we are very much allied with Israel, and we arm Israel, we help fund Israel, we provide military assistance with Israel, and our intelligence agencies, as it talks about here right in the article, and so forth, work very closely. Our Defense Department, our Secretary of State, our intelligence community is all working very closely with the parties there in the Middle East. And of course, again, we have this idea that the evangelical Protestants, or we would also refer to them as apostate Protestants, because they have forsaken the truth of Christ's movement in the sanctuary in heaven since 1844. That's why the second angel's message went forth in the summer of 1844, that Babylon is fallen, was especially now attributing the idea of Babylon not just to the papal power, but then since 1844, we also attribute it to the fallen Protestant churches that rejected the Second Advent doctrine preached by our Advent pioneers. And that there is this false evangelical dispensationalist view of prophecy, both in the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel and in the book of Ezekiel, where they perceive that all the final events are still going to be centered in the Middle East, and that Israel is still talking about literal Israel and not spiritual Israel, and that this final battle of Armageddon and the battle of Gog and Magog will actually be, as the dispensationalist Christians believe, will be between the powers of, say, Russia and Turkey and Middle Eastern Muslim powers on the one hand, and Israel and the United States on the other hand. And that this will be like a final World War III clash, and that this is the fulfillment of prophecy. And of course, we know that the true understanding of the book of Revelation and the final crisis, well, that is actually not centered in the Middle East. It's actually connected to spiritual Babylon and to spiritual Israel, and it's actually pointing to the papal power in Rome and to the apostate Protestants in America, the image of the beast that will be formed. And that this dispensationalist view of the fulfillment prophecy is actually Satan's deception to confuse people to that they might not properly understand what's happening biblically and prophetically. And so we can see these developments in the Middle East as advancing that idea that Satan is doing everything that he can with his control of the powers of the earth as the prince of this earth, and as the governments of this earth are not living in obedience to the law of God and his word, Satan is given permission to have control over the powers of the earth. Of course, Revelation 18 actually tells us that all the nations of the earth, all the kings of the earth, will actually give their power unto the beast and will fornicate with her, will enter into an unholy union together between the religious and the political powers. And so Satan is actually able to marshal the forces of the nations of this earth to make his false prophecy seem to be coming true. And I believe one of the things about the developments that are happening here in this, quote, new era of this battle that's happening will be connected with the fulfillment of this antitypical fifth trumpet and ultimately sixth trumpet. So again, this is what's happened, was especially this new era began on, according to the news, September 20th, 2024. Very interesting. And then also here on September 21st, 2024, the next day, those were the 2 days when we were saying on or about September 20th, depending on whether you're counting with inclusive reckoning or not. Here is a video from YouTube from some user. I don't think it's particularly significant who's the one who actually posted this short clip. It's only less than 3 minutes long. I think we can watch the whole thing. And the headline, or the title to try to probably get views was Israel nukes Lebanon and a question mark. And of course, what we're going to see here, the explosion that we're going to see in this video from September 21st, from Sabbath, this past weekend, it is not a nuke going off, but it can easily be said that if you didn't know that, when you see it, it definitely kind of looks like it. And we'll actually watch it. And then following this video, and of course, because we understand that the sixth trumpet that's going to follow has a connection with fire and smoke and brimstone, and with fire coming down from heaven. This explosion here definitely kind of looks like fire coming down from heaven. And of course, we could think of it as almost like a typical preview of what's to come in later aspects of the fulfillment of these prophecies in antitype. And then for the final minute and a half or 2 minutes of this video, it's actually a brief interview with Mike Pompeo, who is the former Secretary of State in the United States, and he was also the former Director of Central Intelligence. And of course, he's a very prominent Catholic. And so let's see what happens here in this video. So this was an explosion as part of these new era of attacks in the battle between Israel and its perceived enemies in the Middle East. And of course, Israel is again very closely aligned, both in reality with the United States and the political power in the East Coast of the United States, and also especially in the minds of those who are fighting against Israel. So, who again term Israel as the little Satan and as America as the great Satan. So let's see what this looks like. Southern Lebanon, September 21st, 2024.
مثل ما هي لايف.
First off, you have the pager attacks, then you had the radios, now you have this. How much do you think they were able to get surveillance or GPS locations from those pagers as well, and now they're able to hone in on remaining Hezbollah commanders? You know, you mentioned the way America's put its thumb on the scale, usually telling Israel to pull back. Why is it that this administration, Harris, Biden, seems so hell-bent on accelerating the war in, say, Ukraine, in expanding it, widening it, giving more capabilities to the Ukrainians to launch into Russia, but time and time again, pulling Israel back and saying we need to de-escalate their existential fight against Hamas and Hezbollah? Why the difference?
You know, frankly, Pete, they've kind of been the same storyline. We've been very slow, right? We restricted the Ukrainians too. We did provide weapons, but we've provided weapons to the Israelis. What this administration gets wrong, I think in both cases, is it doesn't understand that there is evil in the world, and the only thing that they understand is power and brute force. These guys think, right, you can sit down with Ayatollah. They've been negotiating with them for 3.5 years, giving the Iranians billions of dollars, and then you end up with what we saw now almost a year ago on October 7th. Americans held hostage by the Iranians in Gaza, dead Americans, 1,200 dead Israelis, and the Red Sea now almost impassable. When you negotiate with evil, when you think you can appease them into peace, you create exactly the conflict we see in the world today. And the risk of escalation because of American weakness, Pete, is enormous today. The next 3 or 4 months, while President Biden is nominally in charge, are a really dangerous time period for our country.
Nominally in charge, indeed.
Okay, I hope you guys could hear that as well and see it.
We could.
That's some interesting footage and commentary. And we see from these major news channels and these very significant political commentators who've had very powerful positions in our government, Mike Pompeo, particularly here being again, the former Secretary of State, as it said on the screen. He's also, again, the former Director of Central Intelligence. And, of course, he's a very prominent Catholic. I also just think it's very curious that, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures or video of Mike Pompeo from a few years ago, but he was much more heavy set He's lost.
Yeah, I was thinking that, brother. Yes, he's very thin now. Looks gaunt in the face.
Yes. Well, actually, he's probably lost, I think, 40 or 50 pounds. And according to his own testimony, it's very interesting to me. He actually went on a vegan plant-based diet, and that's how he lost all of his weight. And so I find that very curious. Perhaps the Spirit of God is trying to work on this man's heart. Maybe we should be praying for Mike Pompeo. He might actually come, maybe like a Nebuchadnezzar, to ultimately understand what is truth. But for now, he's a very strong advocate for things that we would consider to be a deception and that are in harmony with the Roman Catholic power and the way it is seeking to control the narrative and the mindset of the people about what is happening. But we see from these news that there is a direct connection to the political power in Washington, in the capital, on the East Coast of the United States, and the developments that are happening here in the Middle East. And also interesting how it tied it in with the war in Ukraine and Russia, all of which, again, is seemingly bringing about circumstances to bring about this alignment of the clash of civilizations that this counterfeit dispensationalist view of prophecy is uplifting and seemingly coming to pass now, or beginning to come to pass. And of course, that's also one of the things that was prophesied by by the occultist, really, Alice A. Bailey and Albert Pike, that there would be a third world war that would be a clash between so-called Christianity and Islam. So these are very interesting developments that we could see as potentially connected with an antitypical fulfillment of the fifth and sixth trumpets. Because especially—
Brother, can I ask?
Go ahead.
Did Aleister Crowley also make that prediction?
I'm not sure if he did, but certainly he was a very prominent occultist who, I mean, he referred to himself as the beast and so forth. And
yes, I know.
he was very prominent in popular culture, being especially connected with the Beatles, for instance. So we see, and of course, we looked at, in looking in type and antitype, and looking at this fire coming down from heaven, especially in Revelation 13, in Revelation 13:14, we see that the purpose of the fire coming down from heaven is to deceive people. So Satan is using these developments to deceive. And so that these developments seem to be promoting this false, deceptive prophetic interpretation fits with that view. And again, it's in creating this clash of civilizations between seemingly Christian powers and seemingly Muslim powers. Again, one of the things that could potentially result from that is that the Western powers could come to the conclusion that they must officially become Christian nations in order to hold off the rise of this Islamic caliphate or theocracy globally. And that would lead, in calling them to become official Christian nations, that would be, in effect, a call to set up the image of the beast. And so I find all of these things very interesting, that this is all coming from September 20th and September 21st last week. Now, some additional news that's followed, just to try and help us see how these things are already beginning to develop in the first few days of this time period, here from September 23rd, 2024, so that's from yesterday. We have this article from Barron's, and there's been many like articles out on other news sites. It says, Iran warns Israel of dangerous consequences of Lebanon strikes. And that there has been calls for retaliatory strikes on both Israel, and then, of course, if America becomes more directly involved, those retaliatory strikes could then extend directly to America in the coming months. So they describe these strikes by Israel as insane, and they warn of the dangerous consequences of the Zionists' new adventure. Now, again, we're not going to get into the political aspects of these, but it's just interesting headlines that there's these strikes and counterstrikes in this tormenting attacks that are happening, which we saw would be connected with terrorist-like attacks. And it really seems on both sides we're having terrorist-like attacks that are fitting into this view of a clash of civilizations. Also, here from the, September 23rd as well, here from the Daily Mail in England, or the UK, we see Israel's war on 5 fronts. How the Jewish state faces an all-out conflict against its Middle Eastern enemies after killing hundreds in the latest Hezbollah strikes, as Lebanon accuses it of carrying out an extermination. So Israel appears to be surrounded on all sides and literally has now 5 war fronts with perceived Middle Eastern, quote, Mahometan or Muslim enemies here in conflict with Israel. This supposed biblical power, according to the evangelicals, which, of course, one of the main consequences, and actually, I believe prophetically, one of the main purposes of both World War I and World War II was actually the establishment of the nation of Israel. We had the Balfour Declaration connected to the Middle East as one of the consequences connected with World War I, and it was the actual founding of the modern state of Israel was one of the consequences of World War II. And actually, Hitler's extermination program of the Jews during World War II actually drove many of the Jewish people all throughout Europe and all throughout the world to go to Israel to start that nation in modern times, which again fits with this false view of the fulfillment of prophecy. And it was very interesting that all these Western powers that supposedly support Israel at that time, back in World War II, those Jews who were fleeing the conflict in Europe initially didn't want to go to Israel and had no plans to go to Israel and start a nation there. Instead, they tried to flee to the Western nations outside of Europe, but they were turned away. The boats full of Jews were turned away from England and the island there. They were turned away from coming to America. And they sort of herded them and forced them to go to the Middle East and start this modern nation of Israel that's now led to all of this conflict there between the two civilizations, as it were. So these are very interesting prophetic developments. And now this is supposedly the fulfillment of this, or seemingly start of the fulfillment of this occult prediction of a third world war. So all of this is very interesting to me. But it definitely, again, as Mike Pompeo said, and as many political commentators would say and in the news, and we see right here from the AP, that this directly actually is involving the US, even militarily. So here we have an article also, I believe, from September 23rd. So this is from yesterday. US is sending more troops to the Middle East as violence rises between Israel and Hezbollah. So more US troops are on their way, even though there's already a significant presence of US troops. I believe there's already 40,000 US troops in the Middle East and a full aircraft carrier battle group. And now a small number of additional troops, it says here, are being sent as a consequence of these latest attacks. But it's actually this Major General from the Pentagon press secretary tells us that they're going to be adding to what is already a 40,000 strong number of troops in the region. And additionally, yesterday, another aircraft carrier battle group, the aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman, 2 Navy destroyers set sail from the east coast of the United States, Norfolk, Virginia, to head to the 6th Fleet area in southern Europe to be prepared to join the other aircraft carrier group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, that's already in the Arabian Gulf. So it seems that America is pre-positioning its military assets to join this fight that Israel is now engaged in, where it's now become essentially surrounded by forces, terroristic forces that are attacking. Very interesting. So we can see how all of this fits in ultimately with this antitypical view of how the prophecy would be fulfilled. Now, yes, it didn't involve direct attacks on the East Coast of the United States on those first 2 days. In thinking that that might happen, I was wrong. I'll readily admit it. But I again said at the time that I wasn't absolutely certain that that's exactly what would happen. It just seemed to fit with my understanding of how it might fulfill antitypically, and that it ultimately would involve the East Coast of the United States as the significant target of these tormenting attacks. And of course, also the more serious developments that are going to come in February next year of 2025, when it shifts to a attack involving fire and smoke and brimstone that leads to the collapse of the antitypical capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. So I think to see how what has begun to happen right according to the time that was predicted could lead in the next 150 days to direct attacks on the East Coast of the United States coming up seems something that seems at least probable or possible, highly possible, and maybe even probable. And so I say that we have to wait and see. Again, my understanding that God gave me was especially to understand the time as I showed on these prophetic charts. And I didn't have clear light or direct light to understand exactly how it would fulfill. And instead, we've been having these studies on type and antitype to see how it fulfilled historically in type, and then trying to draw conclusions on how it might fulfill in antitype. But ultimately, I did say that it would be the case that whatever happened, whether it was a literal fulfillment or even a spiritual fulfillment, that it would be seen in hindsight to be in harmony with the prophetic typology. And I believe that we can already see developments that could be seen to be in harmony with that prophetic typology. Now, the idea that this could ultimately escalate to where it actually would cause serious issues here in the United States is not something that apparently just I'm thinking about. Because here's another article from today, from American Military News. We see the date here, September 24th, 2024. Interestingly, a picture of the U.S. Capitol building at the headline of the article from American Military News, where the East Coast capital of the Roman Empire in our day, and it says lawmakers propose an amendment to address mass casualty events amid rising political tension. So multiple lawmakers, both Republican and Democrats, interesting, have now proposed a constitutional amendment as of, I believe, yesterday, and it's been reported today, to make a certain changes to the continuity of government plans so that should there be a mass casualty event that just sought to disrupt the functioning of the U.S. government, that there would actually be a new constitutional amendment that put in place means so that the government can continue to function in another way somewhere else other than in Washington, D.C. I think this is very significant. Obviously, there are other people who are expecting these things to happen, or we could also think of this news coming out and this being reported as seeking to infuse this mindset into the populace, if they're actually trying to coordinate and bring about these events, which I actually think is ultimately what is taking place. So all of these things in totem together, and again, this is just the news from the past few days since Friday through today, today's Tuesday, September 24th, 2024, I think it's enough significant events that seem to harmonize with significant aspects of what we would understand to be an antitype of the historical fulfillment, that these are developments that we're going to continue to have to watch to see how they develop over the next 150 days. And though I may not have been exactly correct on exactly what would happen on those first 2 days, I didn't say that that was absolutely how it would happen. Again, I was only definitive about the timing, and that when looking back, whatever would happen would ultimately be seen to be in harmony with the historical type. And I see what's happening already does meet those criteria. So we'll see. But that's not all that's happened, because there were other very significant events that's happened in the past 4 or 5 days, beginning again on September 20th. Let's look into that. And it actually brings us all the way back to the beginning of these prophetic periods in September 2015 and the patterns that began there. So the patterns here on the original timeline from September 23rd to 27th, 2015, I say here on my chart, it was a 5-day papal beast conquering of U.S. territory, aka the Glorious Land. That's from Daniel 11:41, where the Pope came to the White House, to the U.S. Congress, to the United Nations, to the 9/11 Memorial, and to the Philadelphia Festival of Families. And of course, specifically at the United Nations, we talked about, and I have whole studies going back several years where I looked at what happened during this time period, and when the Pope went to the United Nations, after he had spoken to Congress in his unprecedented speech to Congress, he then the next day went to the United Nations. And at the United Nations, he not only told all of the world leaders, and it was the previous popes had actually spoken to the United Nations back then, but they had always only spoken to the ambassadors and their staff. But at this meeting in September 2015, it was actually September 25th, 2015, that it happened, that at that meeting, the Pope spoke to the actual leaders of the world. All of the world leaders were present at that meeting. And he not only told them that they had to adopt the, quote, common good as the political philosophy of all the governments of the world, which again, the common good is a Catholic social doctrine that says that all of the civil political power in the world has to put all of the resources at the world at the disposal of the church in order to accomplish its purposes of righteousness by works. But in addition to that, the Pope directed them, almost commanded them, that they had to implement the Sustainable Development Goals in the so-called Agenda 2030, which again, as we see that all of these 2 final 7-year time periods, or a total of 14 years, goes from September 2015 to the fall, ultimately, of 2029, or just before 2030, because Satan actually understands the time that's happening right now. And so this Agenda 2030 and these Sustainable Development Goals were then, after the Pope told all these government leaders, these world leaders, that they must adopt these Sustainable Development Goals, they then voted unanimously without a single opposing vote or a single abstention. Every single leader of every government in the world voted to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals as the policy of all the world governments on that date, September 25th, 2015. By the way, pointing to this midpoint in the 7-year period, where we have a parallel time of 5 days from March 6th to 10th, 2019, just preceding Christ moving up onto the mercy seat in the most holy place, that in that time period, on March 8th, 2019, that's when they had a meeting at the Vatican called religions and the Sustainable Development Goals, which just so happened to be exactly to the literal day, 1,260 days from when the Pope spoke to the UN in 2015 and told them to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, and they all voted to make that the official policy of the governments of the world. All the governments, including our government, the United States, voted to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 on September 25th. And 1,260 days to the literal day brings you to March 8th, 2015, where they had this meeting at the Vatican called Religions in the Sustainable Development Goals, where there were representatives from all the religions in the world, and where the general tenor of the conversation was that the governments of the world, even though they had voted to adopt these policies, actually weren't at their individual government levels actually putting into place these policies, or at least not fast enough for the Pope. And so he suggested to them that all of those religions had to coordinate together to use their, quote, moral influence or moral power to compel the civil power of the governments in their countries to actually implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So literally where the religion is telling the governments what to do. And it wasn't just on an individual country level. This was something that was to be globally coordinated in every government in the world. This was the purpose of this meeting at the Vatican in March 2019. And all of those leaders of every single religion in the world and all agreed that this is what they needed to do. And they further agreed that they needed one person to be the leader and coordinator for them all, and that the only one who, quote, had the moral authority to lead them to do it was the Pope himself. This all happened exactly 1,260 days later from the original vote of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. And of course, it was a couple months later in May 2019 when the Pope officially made the pronouncement that the common good had gone global. And then, of course, within a few months is when the COVID crisis broke out on this earth, where all the governments of the world then had a coordinated global response that was in perfect harmony with Catholic social doctrine. Very interesting. So now, coming back to today, this past week, or at the end of last week, actually beginning on September 20th, 2024, we have what's called, there's a meeting of the United Nations again this year, and it's called, very interesting, the Summit of the Future. Called, and then the subtitle that they themselves have given to this summit is Our Common Agenda. That all the governments of the world have now come together again related to the Sustainable Development Goals in the, quote, Summit of the Future, this dystopian future that they have planned for us, a so-called Great Reset that some people also refer to. And what is the agenda of this Summit for the Future? Well, let's look at that a little bit because it's very interesting to me. So, first of all, there is going to be in this, well, let's start here, the Summit of the Future. So we can see this is from the official UN website, un.org. This is from the English version, Summit of the Future. And if we scroll down, it's from New York 2024. And look at the very interesting dates. September 20th to 21st are, quote, action days. Very interesting. While September 22nd and 23rd, which was Sunday and Monday, that was the actual summit. But for 2 days preceding the summit, beginning on September 20th, very interesting, they have now had these action days for the Summit for the Future. Well, let's see what first of all, what the action days for the Summit of the Future involves. So they actually have a specific website for this called Summit for the Future, un.org, and this is the action days from September 20th and 21st, 2024 at the UN headquarters in New York on the east coast of the United States. Very interesting. Let's see what they themselves say this involves. Here's the overview. The summit offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity for change. It will pave the way to a better tomorrow that we can only shape together. In support of this vision and objectives, the Summit of the Future Action Days will be convened by the Secretary General of the United Nations on 20 and 21 September 2024 at the United Nations headquarters in New York to generate additional opportunities for engagement of all actors. Remember, they voted to adopt these Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 in September 2015 at the beginning of this final 2 periods of 7 in the end. And then from when the UN adopted that to they had their religions and sustainable development goals meeting at the Vatican was exactly 1,260 days later, to the literal day, where they said the governments weren't implementing it. And so the religions had to use their moral authority to compel the governments to implement it. And now here, this Summit of the Future action agenda is the plan to actually implement it.
Excuse me, Brother Craig. It says all actors. Is that what you said?
Yes, isn't that interesting that they refer to themselves as actors?
Hypocrites, then.
Hypocrites. Yes, the Bible word for hypocrite actually means actor. Of course, they're playing their part in the fulfillment of prophecy. They know what they're doing. Of course, the UN itself, as part of my original studies on what happened in September 2015, I had a whole video, I think it was almost 3 hours long, where we looked at the history of the United Nations and how it's actually an incredibly occult organization. All of its policies and procedures and principles are based on the writings of Alice A. Bailey from Theosophy, who was like the occult Ellen White. It's the only one, the one woman in the world who's written almost as much as Ellen White has, but it's all channeled writings from Lucifer about how he is the logos, the word, and how he's going to bring a bright future for the world. It's literally what she said. The entire Common Core, World Core curriculum, the curriculum for all of the schools in the entire world for about over 2 decades, 2.5 decades, has been based on the writings of Alice A. Bailey, this occultist Luciferian who channeled writings from demons. And the entire United Nations, the United Nations themselves, the founders of the United Nations, who themselves were all occultists, said that it was not, quote, a man-made organization. Well, who made it if it wasn't man-made? It certainly wasn't the God of heaven, but it appears to be the God of this earth, Satan. And so it's interesting, how they said they're all actors and how they need to become engaged and actually implement the agenda because their time is running out and Satan knows his time is short. So bringing together representatives from member states, civil society, private sector, academia, local and regional authorities, the youth, and many more, the Action Days will provide an opportunity for broad engagement and inclusion. These stakeholders have all played a key role in shaping the Pact for the Future and its annexes and will be critical to, quote, implementation. The Action Days will kick off with a dedicated youth-led afternoon followed by a Saturday program which will focus on the 3 priority themes: digital and technology, peace and security. What's another way of saying peace and security? Peace and safety, and sustainable development and financing. In addition to the 3 themes, there will also be a dedicated focus throughout the day on future generations. Expected participants include heads of state, ministers, senior UN officials, and representatives from the private sector, civil society, and other actors. Very interesting. By the way, according to themselves, we'll look at their agenda. Shaping our world together. That's man doing it, not God doing it. This is a man-centered plan for the world to save ourselves. That's righteousness by works. It's also based on a man-centered religion instead of a God-centered religion. It's humanism, writ large. So we've got summary videos if you want to look into this. We're not going to look at every single detail, but it began on day 1, Friday, September 20th, 2024. Very, very interesting. And there seems to be this a special focus on capturing the minds of the youth. Aren't we told under inspiration that having a youth rightly trained will actually help finish the work? So Satan's trying to capture the youth and have them rightly trained to bring about his satanic kingdom. And so there are very interesting developments. It was 2 days, Friday and Sabbath, the 6th and the 7th days of the week, and right exactly at this prophetic time for the antitypical fulfillment of the fifth trumpet. And it ultimately ties all the way back to these end time day principle antitypical fulfillments that began in September 2015, when the King of the North came in and planted his flag and established dominion here in the East Coast of the United States. So we'll just put some of the highlights here on for us. We won't look at every single detail, but it's very, very interesting what they're planning to do. And you see, it's actually involving every single aspect of society. They want to control everything. It's the federal governments, the national governments, the local and state governments, the civil society organizations, the nonprofits, the private sector, academia. That's the Chaldeans of our day, the youth, everybody, those in arts and literature. It leaves nothing out. Every single aspect of society needs to be drawn into this agenda to make it happen. It's action days. It's time for the action to come about. You can't make this stuff up. This is all just from their own official websites. Time's sake, we won't go all through it, but we can see the addresses for those who want to look more into it. Now, back here to the official summit, which then happened on the 22nd and 23rd, Summit of the Future Outcome document. So the world leaders did adopt a pact for the future. That's like a compact or a covenant that they made that includes a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations. The pact covers a broad range of themes, including peace and security, again, peace and safety, sustainable development, climate change, digital cooperation, human rights, gender, youth, and future generations, and the transformation of global governments. The transformation of global governance. This is about the actual transformation necessary to bring about one world government. That is prophesied in the scriptures. So let's look at, they actually have a document here. They had a pre-document before the summit that was still available on the website, but you can see at the end of this official UN site, this is not just the Summit for the Future Pact for future generations, but this is the actual adopted one. So whatever additional changes that they actually made in the past 2 days at the summit has been updated into this Summit of the Future Outcomes document from September 2024. So let's look at some of the things that are found in this. Again, we don't have all the time. It's hundreds of pages long, I believe, so we can't look at it all, but we can just scan through the table of contents here. It begins with sustainable development. Again, sustainable development goals we looked at very clearly in my earlier studies from several years ago about the Pope's original visit when they adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, but they actually are all based on Catholic social doctrine, not just the common good, but also on the principle of solidarity and the principle of subsidiarity. And I have whole studies on that. Solidarity is the idea that we need to all cooperate together to bring about the common good. And subsidiarity is the idea that all of the policies need to, as much as possible, be implemented at the most local level possible, but that there still needed to be one overarching person who's in charge of it all, who is, of course, ultimately the Pope. So let's see, and no, it starts with, and look at all of the items in every single item in their own table of contents is referred to as an action item, because it's now time to implement. Remember, it was voted, and then they had the meeting 1,260 days later, where the religions said they had to use their moral influence to get the governments to implement it because they weren't implementing it, or at least not fast enough for their Agenda 2030. And now here is the actual blueprint of how they're going to implement it, because they're agreeing, and they've all agreed. All the world leaders, again, have come together and agreed to implement it, to actually implement it with an action agenda. So action 1, we will take bold, ambitious, accelerated, just, and transformative actions to implement the 2030 agenda, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and leave no one behind. Do you remember during the COVID crisis that was one of the slogans, that we're all in this together and we can't leave anyone behind? This is all Catholic social doctrine. And they have an action agenda to bring these things about by 2030, because that's when this all comes to a conclusion. This whole world and rebellion of sin. It includes, in order to do that, this transformative agenda that they're going to implement, and they're accelerating now because they're running out of time. Action 2, we will place the eradication of poverty at the center of our efforts. How much power do you need in this world, and control over governments and over the economies of every government to eradicate poverty? Sounds like total control to me. Do you need to be able to control all the economies of the world if you want to be able to implement a no buy, no sell agenda that's about to break forth on this world? Where they leave, when it says leave no one behind, that means leave no one out. That means you can't opt out. That's what they mean by leave no one behind. You can't say, I don't want anything to do with this. I'm going to do my own thing. No, no, no. There's no opting out of this agenda. Everybody has to go along with it. And if you don't go along with it, then you're the ones who are preventing it from being implemented. That's actually what they're setting. They know they can't actually accomplish their goals. So what they're doing is they're setting up the means by which to blame certain groups, a specific certain group who honor the law of God, as the ones who are preventing it from being implemented completely. And so the only way they can leave no one behind is to eliminate all those who are trying to stay behind. They're going to action 3, we'll end hunger and eliminate food insecurity and all forms of malnutrition. They want to control all the food systems of the world. By the way,
I've got a question.
Yes, my sister.
Now, as these things start happening, and like, for instance, the activities that the management helps us do in our apartment complex, we used to have programs here. And of course, we always asked ourselves how much we should participate. At what point, I mean, it's okay to pick up trash on the sidewalk, right? But at what point do we stop participating in helping to take responsibility to care for the earth? We recycle, we pick stuff off the ground. I'm just picking this one subject because this is where they seem to get us on the local level.
Yeah.
And we all, I see the program. I see the programs regarding the sustainable houses and how interesting they are, and the interesting things that that communities are doing to make birds come to the community more.
I understand.
And I find that they're interesting.
Yes. Well, first of all, right from Genesis 1, God made us stewards of this earth. Yes? That's what he
Right.
meant to have dominion over the earth. He didn't mean to dominate the earth. He meant to be good stewards, that the earth was actually God's, and God was putting us in charge of the earth to take care of it, not to dominate it. And so the idea of caring for
Right.
the earth is good. See, Satan has no original ideas. He only can counterfeit ideas. So this sustainable development that they're promoting is ultimately a counterfeit. But in order to be a successful counterfeit, it has to look as much as possible as the real. If somebody tried to
Yeah.
pass off to you a counterfeit $100 bill, but it looked like monopoly money, well, no one would accept that. But if it looks very much
Right.
like a $100 bill, but there's only slight differences that show that it's a counterfeit, that's when it can actually deceive people. So that's what Satan's doing with all of these things. So there's nothing
So
wrong
it's
with
just
participating with your neighbors to pick up trash and to keep things nice around your apartment building. The place where you can't keep going along with it is when doing so requires you to make choices that directly violate the law of God and the word of God. And right now, they're
well,
probably
the only
not
thing.
doing that. They're gonna draw people in by actually not bringing out these points that actually deviate from God's word until you're already fully part of the system and think it's good. So I, by God's grace, sister, you have discernment and you can participate in these things right up until they start trying to get you to do things that you shouldn't. And you can see you
Well,
can see picking up the trash even
the
when
only
they do
thing I'm
that. Just
aware.
don't do it their way.
Okay, so like if I'm doing it with my hands, for instance, and they're giving me something that they own to do it with to make it easier for me to pick up more trash, is that doing it their way?
No.
Or the only thing I can think of is doing it on Sunday would be bad, or doing it on Sabbath would be bad.
Well,
But
those things will probably become part of the agenda eventually, but they're not now. They also might eventually say, if you don't do it, well, then you can't keep living in this building or something like that. Those kind of
how can I
things.
know? How can we know if we're doing it too much their way on a weekday, for instance? Maybe they're asking us to do it their way and compromise another way on a weekday that has to do with something else besides the Sabbath.
Well, okay, I don't want to
Or,
spend too much on this study right now.
sorry,
We can answer these questions
yeah.
later, but the short answer is, how can we know how to do anything? We pray and we ask the Holy Spirit, sister, for discernment. That's the
Well,
only way we'll know,
we
and God will help us. Don't
already
think that
know
He won't.
that.
God understands that this is happening, and those who want to do what is right in God's eyes, He'll help them to know what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. So. So let's
Guess
let's
it's a
press
dumb
on.
question.
I can try to answer questions like that at another study. So, but I'm just trying to see the overarching, sweeping aspects of this agenda right now. So, ending hunger and eliminating food security means they have to control all the food in the entire world, and that's part of the agenda. Again,
Yeah.
one of the patterns of 2 patterns of 7 years from the scriptures is in Genesis 41. In Pharaoh's dream, you have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. Because we're in the second pattern of 7 years, we're actually in the time when there's going to be famine. And so they want to control all of the food resources of the world. And they have an agenda
But
to, an action plan to actually make that happen. Yes,
didn't
Joseph is,
Joseph have to control? I mean, he controlled as prime minister of
yes.
an entire country. He controlled he
And,
saved a certain
yes.
portion back
And
of the
who was Joseph
grain.
serving when he did that, sister?
Well, he was serving the Lord.
Yes, he is. And so Satan learned from that situation, though, that the way that you control people is by controlling food. Yes, because in that
Yeah.
story, they first sold their lands to Joseph to get food, and then they
Yeah.
sold them their children and themselves to get food. So Satan learned from what God did, and now Satan's counterfeiting that. That's what's happening. This is a counterfeit of the truth. And it goes right back. God tells us the end from the beginning.
They both
So,
did the same thing.
yes, the same thing is happening. It's just a counterfeit. We will close Sustainable Development Goals financing gap in developing countries, so they need to control the economic system again. They're going to ensure that the multilateral trading system continues to be an engine for sustainable development, so they need to control all the trade between all the nations. Again, that's economic power. They were going to strengthen efforts.
Why did they have to sell their?
What's that, sister?
Why did they have to sell their? Why did they have to sell their children to Joseph? I mean, what's the difference between selling their children to Joseph and selling their children to Satan? It's the same thing.
No, it's not even close to the same thing, sister. It just looks like the same thing. When you sell yourself to God, is that a bad thing? Or is that
Well,
actually
no,
the
but
best thing that can possibly happen to you?
it's physically the same. If
No,
people
but no,
before
no.
me,
If the person who's in charge is a benevolent, loving God, it's completely different from the person being in charge, being a diabolical tyrant who wants to destroy you. There's not anything close to the same thing about it. But it looks like the same thing because it's a counterfeit. Just like the so-called agenda for the Great Reset. What's the tagline that they say with it? You will own nothing and you will be happy. Yes? Well,
Yeah.
actually, in the system that God has for us, we'll own nothing and we will be happy. But it's because God's in charge. But Satan has a counterfeit of that system where he's going to lead everybody where they'll no longer be able to own anything. And he claims they'll be happy, but you actually won't be happy. You'll be miserable, but you won't have any control because it will be imposed upon you. See, the system with God is a willing choice. And
yeah,
Joseph actually gave them food, and he actually gave them food on very good terms. And he didn't really enslave the people, even though he could have. But Satan will do that. That's really the difference. It's just Satan is getting his playbook from looking at what happened in the past and twisting it to fit his satanic designs.
right.
And it fits prophetically with the fulfillment because it's happening again in a pattern of 7 years and 7 years. So we see there's about making things peaceful and just and inclusive. So all these agendas about gender and about race and all these counterfeits, and it claims to uphold human rights and fundamental rights. It just doesn't uphold the law of God. Anything but the law of God. And actually all of it directly counterfeits and contradicts the law of God. Just like we will, Action 8, we will achieve gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls, which sounds good, except that isn't in harmony with what God's word says. God's word said because of sin and how sin came into the world, that the man would have to rule over the woman. It wasn't God's ideal, it was the plan B in consequence of the crisis. But it actually, again, even that had symbolic meaning. That the man symbolically represented God in the relationship, and the woman symbolically represented all humanity, both men and women. And the only way that there can be harmony in this world, and actually in the whole universe, is if all humanity, both men and women, are in submission to God. That's actually the lesson. But Satan wants to undo that and change and make say that you can have a position that wasn't given to you or a role that wasn't given to you by God, which is again one of the lies that the serpent said in the garden. Yes, he said, "You shall be as gods." That was not a role that was given to humanity to be gods, but he made them covet and want to have it. And he's doing the same thing to women today. And of course, women have been so taken advantage of by men who took this position where they were supposed to love their wives and to the point of giving up their own life to ensure their happiness and safety. And instead, they've abused that position, and women have suffered terribly over the past 6,000 years because of it, to the point that now women rebel against the whole system and they want to be, quote, equal. But that's not how God made us. And it's all twisting people's minds with confusion. That's why it's called Babylon. It's total spiritual confusion. But it because of how we've been taught in school and how we've grown up in our culture, it sounds good to us, which is Satan's masterpiece of deception. So all of these things, we will strengthen our actions to address climate change. Of course, the scriptures tell us that the climate is going to change and that there's going to be great calamities of the weather in this world. Just like as it was in the days of Noah, well, there was a global climate change in the days of Noah. And so it will be in the time of the Son of Man comes. And of course, inspiration tells us that these calamities of hurricanes and tornadoes and floods are all going to ultimately be blamed on those Sabbath keepers. And that's why, because we're not honoring Sunday. That's where the agenda is going. That's why they need an agenda to try to control the climate or try to make people think that there's something different happening in the climate or the reasons why it's happening are different from the reality. It's all about
it's already happening between Republicans and Democrats. You know, you see the polarization and the name calling and and the polarization between the vaxxers and the non-vaxxers and
and that's the king of the north and the king of the south. But they actually behind the scenes they sit at one table and tell lies together, and they're all ultimately going to unite around this agenda. They pretend like they're at odds with each other over these things, but in the end, they're going to unite over this agenda. And again, all the world governments have now just voted to accept this agenda. There's no opposing parties. And again, things about the environment. They're even going to get into culture and sport. It's Action 11. For Action 12, we will plan for the future and strengthen our collective efforts to turbocharge the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by 2030. So this action plan that has just been implemented in the past couple days and adopted fully has a means and not just a theoretical principles, it has an action agenda to actually bring it about within the next 5 years.
It's not a lot of time.
No, it's not. And it's going to require an entire transformation of this world and society. The very one that we've been predicting for so long will come according to the scriptures in the book of Revelation. And again, there's this whole agenda connected with international peace and security. And again, another word for security is safety. The peace and safety agenda. It's being announced right here. And what follows the announcement of peace and safety? Sudden destruction, which, by the way, is coming quite possibly as soon as February, when the sixth trumpet will begin to blow, and the fire and the smoke and the brimstone appear to come down from heaven. And possibly, according to the typological pattern in Genesis, destroy entire cities. I'm not saying I'm not saying absolutely that's what would happen, but that could be seen as one of the ways it could fulfill antitypically according to the typical pattern that we find in Scripture.
Well, I was thinking somewhere along the lines of that happening more toward the total, almost, or after the total fulfillment of this in 2030.
Well, there may be another fulfillment then as well. These are repeating patterns.
Because they've been able by that time to implement the idea of peace and safety, and seems like it doesn't seem to make sense to me that sudden destruction would come upon them at the beginning of the implementation of all of this.
Well,
I could be wrong.
We'll see, or maybe it will be on a more limited level, say in one nation, ours, that leads to the call for the setup of the image of the beast, that ultimately brings about the actual global agenda that's in action, comes about and implemented, that ultimately in the end does lead to this global destruction. So yes,
Right.
because again, things happen in repeating patterns.
Yeah.
So this peace and security, which gets right to the heart of what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, and this clash of civilizations and this false dispensationalist view of the fulfillment of prophecy. There's a huge section here on action agendas related to that, including beginning at Action 13. We will redouble our efforts to build and sustain peaceful, inclusive, and just societies and address the root causes of conflicts. We will protect all civilians in armed conflicts. By the way, if the UN, if some global government is going to protect all citizens in every armed conflict, then doesn't the UN have to have armed forces that can go into any country in the world and take over to accomplish that purpose? I don't quite know how else they could do it.
They already do.
Yes, they do. And they're, again, the governments, including our government, are agreeing to establish these systems, not just in principle anymore, but to actually establish and implement them. And they, of course, they put in things that sound good, that people will go along with this and agree to it, like ensuring that people affected receive humanitarian emergency assistance, which who can be against that? We will promote cooperation and understanding between member states, diffuse tensions, and seek pacific settlement of disputes and resolve conflicts. So they make these things sound good, but they're actually very sinister in many ways when you look at what they really mean at the base level. Like Action 17 will fulfill our obligation to comply with the decisions and uphold the mandate of the International Court of Justice in any case to which our state is a party. So that's putting the International Court of Justice, this global, unaccountable judicial system, above the entire judicial system in the United States, for instance. And the same for every other country in the world. They claim they're going to actually build and sustain peace. Can there be any peace without Jesus at the center? No, there cannot. By the way, Jesus said when he sent his message of truth, was it going to bring peace or was it going to bring a sword? He actually said it was going to bring a sword. The purpose, Jesus's purpose in sending the truth was to bring peace if we would just comply and come into harmony with him. But because people rebel against it, it actually leads to a sword where brother is against brother and father against son and daughter against mother, and the people of your own household will be your enemies, he said. That's both your literal household and your spiritual church household. And then they make specific agendas for all different categories of identified groups, which actually pits groups against each other in the mindset. So they've got one for women, they've got one for youth, they've got one for races, they've got one for every type of agenda to try to seem like they're supporting people while they're actually pitting people against each other. And we can't look at everything, but they need to deal with maritime security, so they need to control all the oceans of the world. We'll pursue a future free from terrorism. So how much power and control do you need to actually implement that? And of course, very interesting that these attacks are in the tormenting phase are seen as terrorist attacks, which can actually lead to a backlash where the enforcing power needs to come in to eliminate that threat.
It's happening on a local level in that privacy is kind of a thing of the past. Even if you go into a management office and say there's a rent hike for everyone else, and your rent is stable because you have a voucher or something, and somehow the other neighbors know that you have a voucher when their rent is increasing, and so their focus becomes on you.
Yeah, yes, that's all connected to these types of agendas, sister.
Yeah.
So, ultimately, we can't get into every detail right now, but
Oh, no, I
again,
know. I was just,
action 24 here, they're going to prevent and combat transnational organized crime and illicit financial flows. Which, by the way, the papal power and the intelligence agencies of every nation in the world are actually the main powers behind transnational organized crime and illicit financial flows. So they're actually creating the problem, and now they claim they're the ones who are going to solve the problem. And of course, the ways that they solve the problem is not by actually solving the problem, but like when you hear about all these, justice organizations, the FBI and the Homeland Security and the CIA, and how they take out an organized crime group or some drug traffickers, what they're actually doing is taking away the competition because they're the ones who want to control it all. They don't want to get rid of it, they want to control it all, and they need to get rid of any competitors. And the same with illicit financial flows. They claim that any system that competes with the central bank system that they've set up to control the financial system of the world, anything like the cryptocurrencies and the bitcoins, they claim, oh, that's where all the illicit finances are going through Bitcoin. And that's how the terrorists finance themselves, is by using Bitcoin or something like that, which is absurd. All of the major criminal financial financing that happens in the world is going right through those same exact central banks. And it's done in secrecy because no one has a right to actually look at their books. And that can be proven. There's been many people who've done very interesting reporting on how every single major global bank in this world has been actually convicted by various governments of the world of conducting multi-billion-dollar fraudulent money laundering operations for criminal organizations. Without exception, all of the major banks have actually been convicted of these things, even by these very governments. We will advance the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. Interesting, they're involving the nuclear weapons in their agenda. Again, that is something that could be at least perceived as being connected with fire come down from heaven. And we're not saying definitively that's what it will be, but it could be perceived that way. They have disarmament obligations, so they somehow are going to control all the militaries of the world. We will seize opportunities associated with emerging technologies and the potential risks posed by their misuse. So they want to control all the technology companies in the world. Again, they have a whole section on science and technology and how they're going to use that to help implement this whole Agenda 2030 of controlling every aspect of society. And we can see how that's in many ways coming to pass. Again, they have a whole section 4 here on the youth and the future generations, where again, for at least probably one or two or three in reality, generations of youth have for their entire life, their school system has been according to this world education agenda that's actually satanic and based on the writings of Alice A. Bailey. That the mindset has generationally been put in the minds of everybody who's probably at least 40 years old or younger, to completely have no resistance to this system coming to pass. Because that's the way they've been taught their whole life. It's been infused into every single subject in school in a very, very subtle way that was not perceived as they were learning. And here they say it's not only on a national level, but it's also at an international level. They need to be doing these things. And then section 5 about transforming global governments, how they're going to actually take control of all of the governments of the world and put them in one system here, supposedly under the control of the United Nations. So we will, action 38, we will transform global governments and reinvigorate the multilateral system to tackle the challenges, seize the opportunities of today and tomorrow. So they're going to not just work on global governments, they're going to transform it. and actually implement it. And they're going to reform the Security Council. So the whole head of this UN global organization is also about to be completely transformed and reformed, and seem to be made better. And again, there's a economic aspect to it. There's a peace building aspect to it. There's a human right aspect to it. Again, human rights, again, sounds good, but it's actually making humans the center instead of God's law the center, which is actually the ultimate system of human rights is found in God's law, which they reject. And they have a whole financial architecture to bring it in place. Everything has been planned out and everything has been agreed upon, and all of the nations have now voted to adopt it and make it reality immediately. And they're going to have a way to have an international response to complex global shocks. So any great crisis that arises like COVID in the future, they're going to have a global response where every nation needs to follow the same script in implementing how they respond. And maybe we can just look at the end here, some guiding principles. That's on page 57. Whoa. We're really running out of time. It's getting late here. But let's just see, guiding principles.
Will these things
Yes, go
will
ahead.
these things be set forth in Brother Tim's book?
No, Brother Tim doesn't talk about these things that are happening here on earth. Brother Tim's book is all about what's happening in heaven, and how actually what's happening in heaven is the driving force that's triggering Satan's reaction here on earth to do these things.
Oh.
Satan understands what Jesus is doing in the heavenly sanctuary and how he's moving again. He's moving out of the heavenly sanctuary back to this earth. And that's how he knows his time is short, like it says in Revelation chapter 12. And so he's actually compelling the governments of this world to actually implement his agenda to set up his satanic kingdom on earth, because he knows he's running out of time. So that's a great question.
As you
sis.
mentioned a book.
Yes.
You mentioned a reference to a book.
So these things that are happening in the trumpets here are connected with Satan's reaction to the reality of what's happening in the heavenly sanctuary that is talked about in Pastor Raymond's book, High Priest to King, The Judgment of the Living. I love Pastor Raymond's book because unlike almost all the people that are talking about end time events, he focuses on what's going on in heaven, not what's happening here on earth. But now that we understand what's happening in heaven, we can also understand what's happening here on earth and why it's happening, and also what's going to happen and when it's going to happen, because Satan is reacting to what's happening in heaven. And we first need to understand that correctly. And praise the Lord that the Lord has given this brother insight to help us understand that from the scriptures. All right, we can't spend, I think, any more time on the sum of the future. So I thought this would be a brief study, but it's ended up being longer than I thought. But I hope we can see that this date of September 20th and September 21st as the start, and of course we know biblically days actually go from evening to morning. And so a biblical day actually stretches across 2 calendar days on the Babylonian calendar. So saying from September 20th to September 21st as the start date also fits in within that idea of being the start of this pattern. And there was very, very significant global events connected with this date, September 20th, that again can be seen as potentially fulfilling an antitypical blowing of the fifth trumpet. I don't think we can definitively say that. We can say that it seems to be starting that way, even though it wasn't exactly the way I thought it might happen. But again, I didn't know for sure the way it would happen. I only was certain about the timing. And that again, when it did happen, it would be seen to be in harmony with the typological fulfillment and with what the scriptures say in Revelation 9. And I believe that it appears that that is in fact the case, and that we won't ultimately know until we see what happens over the next 5 months. Any last thoughts or questions or comments? We will press on in our next study tomorrow in getting back into Revelation 9 and the typological fulfillment in history, and also how we could see that fulfilling antitypically as we go through each verse in Revelation 9 and each symbol in Revelation 9. And again, we'll actually start looking at the scorpions of Revelation 9 in our study tomorrow night. Here, let's pray. Heavenly Father, our most holy Creator God, we thank you so much that you've helped us to have discernment about these things, that you have revealed the time and the principles to understand from the Bible how to understand the time, and that we expected things of significant prophetic developments and fulfillment to happen beginning last Friday, September 20th, and Sabbath 21st. And that now we see that very significant things have actually happened. And we especially see, and what we can most see on this earth is how Satan is reacting to what you're doing in heaven. The things that are happening in heaven, we can understand from your word, and we can have insight to by faith, not by sight. The things that we can see are the counterfeits that are actually fulfilling here on earth. And we can see that these developments do correspond to a counterfeit of your works in the scriptures, and that they also harmonize or appear to begin to harmonize with an understanding of Revelation 9, both historically as according to the exposition of Josiah Litch, connected with the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, and that they can also be seen as beginning to correspond to with some of the antitypical ways in which they may be fulfilling in our day as we understand the symbols clearly from Scripture, spiritually. Please help us as we continue to study the spiritual meaning of the symbols in Revelation chapter 9 from your word and from your word alone, so that when we seek to make applications in antitype, we can be solidly grounded on Scripture as we see them fulfill. And continue to give us discernment above by your Holy Spirit. Protect us from every error and every deception and all fanaticism. And help us to remain grounded on the rock Christ Jesus, and our lamps trimmed and burning, and filled with oil of your Spirit by your grace alone, so that when these things continue to come to pass, that we might stand and not fall, is our prayer. May it be in Jesus' name. Amen and amen.
Amen.
Amen.